Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Paying Off P2P, Closing the Purchase Through Payment Loop. My name is Richard Waugh. I'm from Zycus. I'll introduce myself and my co-presenter momentarily. Just before we get started today, a couple of housekeeping notes. Please feel free to log in any questions you may have in the Q&A chat dialog box on the WebEx platform, and we'd be happy to address as many of your questions as we have time for. And also, within 48 hours of your attendance, you'll be receiving a thank you email for attending, and along with a copy of the slide deck that you can download for your own reference. So, again, today it's Paying Off P2P, Closing the Purchase Through Payment Loop. My name is Richard Waugh. I'm Vice President Corporate Development at Zycus. I'm pleased to be joined by Byron Biggins, who has a similar role, Vice President of Business Development at InvoicePay. And I'll go ahead and spoiler alert, we're announcing a partnership between Zycus and InvoicePay to effectively close that purchase through payment loop, and we're going to share with you a lot of good information today on why that's critical, what the business case is for doing it, how we do it, and certainly how Zycus and InvoicePay have come together in a partnership mode to really provide that capability. So thanks, Byron, for joining today.
Yep, thanks for having me, Richard.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit just before we get into the agenda about who Zycus is, who InvoicePay is. Let me first tackle the Zycus side here. So Zycus is an integrated suite of software modules spanning source-to-pay processes. So everything from on the front end, spend analytics to identify and uncover savings opportunities, e-sourcing tools to execute on those opportunities, contract management to make sure that those identified savings turn into realized savings, supplier management to effectively onboard and monitor and measure supplier performance, as well as the focus area for today, Procure-to-Pay. So both P's of Procure-to-Pay, e-procurement, the requisitioning and PO side, as well as the second P, the invoice automation side of receiving an electronic invoice and completing the three-way match to the PO. And we're going to talk in a second about how InvoicePay then closes ultimately that payment loop with a ready-to-pay or an okay-to-pay invoice that now can automate the actual payment process. And sort of rounding out the suite of Zycus solutions is a financial savings management module to make sure that all of the savings that accrue through this kind of an automation process are accurately documented and signed off, and that full credit is given for the contributions being made. And Zycus, we've been consistently recognized as a leader. For example, the fourth time in a row in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for suite vendors, just published the latest iteration for 2018, and once again recognized as a leader. So that's a little bit about who Zycus is. I'd ask Byron to give us some insight into InvoicePay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. So InvoicePay is a payment automation company. We started back in 2009, been around about 9 years, and really focused on finishing off where a solution like Zycus leaves off and executing the payment in the most cost-effective way. So I'm happy to jump into details as we go along through this presentation, but a little bit of background on the company. We have over 500 existing customers. Many of them have multiple business units, so there's actually 2,700 accounts that we support. We have over 99% customer retention rate. Extremely rare we ever lose a customer once they start using the solution. Last year we paid 500,000 suppliers through our solution, and we can pay suppliers in 170 countries using 140 different currencies. And last thing I'll mention is we've been very quick growing ever since the beginning. Last year we grew about 105%.
Awesome. So we think it's a powerhouse combination, and we're going to be really talking through the course of our webinar today around how the combination can really solve the end-to-end purchase through payment challenge in a very efficient way and a way that can produce significant returns to your business. And just before I overview the agenda, I'll just mention very quickly, Zycus, our annual Horizon Conference is rapidly approaching. It's the end of October, the 28th through 30th. And it's an opportunity to certainly to get a glimpse into solutions like the one we're talking about today. But just as importantly, it's a chance to share best practices, hear from industry thought leaders, and really collaborate and network with your peers across the purchasing and finance community in particular. And as a thank you for everyone attending today, you can see there's a code here that would provide a discount. So we're already finding ways to save money. We haven't even started yet. So with that aside, and we'll jump right into the agenda today. So what we wanted to do is talk about, first of all, what's going on in the world of Procure-to-Pay. And after all, it's not a new market space. You know, the first e-procurement tools probably came online around the turn of the century, which makes it sound very old, but you know, in the late 90s, around 2000. But we're kind of in the midst of this resurgence of interest in Procure-to-Pay. So let's call it the P2P 2.0 renaissance. So let's take a look at what are the market dynamics, what's going on, what's driving this renewed interest in Procure-to-Pay. And then let's kind of take a look at what are some of the key P2P automation benchmarks, I think really helpful for anyone considering embarking on this journey, or maybe part of the way through that journey, to be able to kind of keep tabs on or kind of assess where you are relative to the market overall, and therefore what the opportunity may be when you see some gaps in performance around some of these key P2P automation benchmarks. And in many respects, when it comes to Procure-to-Pay, certainly many organizations address the first P first, and therefore many organizations are kind of looking at payments now as the final frontier of AP and certainly P2P automation. And Byron's really going to take us through that payment automation journey, really understand where the market is today, what the opportunities are, and what's being accomplished. And we'll kind of wrap everything up by, you know, our title sort of encapsulates the message here, paying off P2P. And the payoff is in the form of what is the business case, what's the return on investment. And it's a very compelling opportunity for most organizations. And we'll kind of share a couple of quick case studies that also help to kind of equate your situation to what others may have faced in terms of similar challenges, and what strategies did they implement, and what results have they been able to realize. So a lot of ground to cover. So let me jump right in then. Let's talk about this P2P 2.0 renaissance. And we'll start with the Forrester Wave for e-procurement. So this is Forrester being one of the leading analyst firms, produced their most recent Wave report on the e-procurement space, in which Zycus was featured as a leader, as you see from the diagram here. And they really cited the fact that there is this renaissance going on, this P2P 2.0 resurgence, if you will, just looking at the growth rate in the market. So the market's growing 11%, double-digit growth year over year. It is in excess of $4 billion in terms of the current market for e-procurement. So what's driving this growth? Certainly the tools for Procure-to-Pay that are much more user-friendly and intuitive than first-generation tools. As I mentioned, when e-procurement first came on the scene in the late 90s, is really making it easier for end users to adopt these tools, and therefore is resulting in much higher transaction volumes. So Forrester, for instance, estimates there's a 3-to-1 ratio of corporate purchasing being done through a B2B kind of a Procure-to-Pay tool, as opposed to organizations just going out directly to suppliers, sell-side e-commerce sites, and purchasing directly. So $3 trillion in true B2B transactions through Procure-to-Pay systems, as opposed to just about $1 trillion where organizations go directly and purchase from sell-side e-commerce sites. So it almost sounds kind of appealing that you'd want to just go directly and buy from the supplier, sort of cut out the middleman. But there are a number of good reasons why this ratio exists, why most procurement organizations are adopting as a best practice, a best-of-breed procure-to-pay tool set to really drive much higher compliance. Because after all, if end users go and shop directly at sellers' e-commerce sites, number one, they may be buying from someone other than your approved contracted vendor, and number two, very unlikely to be getting your contracted pricing, probably paying something more like a retail price. End users going directly to sell-side e-commerce sites really means an opportunity for a maverick purchase. And the goal of these procure-to-pay systems is to give users that rich, intuitive kind of business-to-consumer shopping experience, but do so within a controlled environment. So you're presenting them with curated catalogs of products from preferred contracted vendors only. So you're making it easier for them to do the right thing, to make a compliant purchase. And in the process, you're getting much better visibility before the fact, before purchase decisions are made, to be able to control those, make sure they're in line with your budgetary targets and purchasing policies and procedures. So done right, it's kind of the best of both worlds, giving users that sort of intuitive Amazon-like experience that they're searching for, but within the controlled environment of a business-to-business procure-to-pay system that drives higher levels of compliance, better auditability, and traceability as well. So that's at a high level sort of what's going on, the dynamics that are driving this resurgence in procure-to-pay. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other key findings from the Forrester e-procurement wave. They really say, what's driving this 2.0 of P2P tools is artificial intelligence, analytics, and customer centricity. That those are the key differentiators, that the leaders need exceptionally smart and easy to use software. Otherwise, end users will go directly and buy from sell-side e-commerce sites without the approval workflows in place, or the budgetary controls, or even perhaps buying from someone other than an approved contracted vendor. And specific to the Zycus capability in this space, the quote here from Forrester says, Zycus has earned a great reputation for easy-to-use upstream e-purchasing software, which has now been extended to downstream or procure-to-pay as well. And the strength is smart software behind the scenes that makes users' tasks easier. So a quick example, what does all this mean? How does AI contribute to a better UX, the better user experience? So it all boils down to guided buying. And when an end user first logs into any procure-to-pay tool, that initial search is really the moment of truth. Can they find what they're looking for? Because after all, if they can't find what they need quickly and easily, odds are they may decide to go elsewhere and make a non-compliant purchase. So right at the outset, at that moment of truth, AI is guiding the user to the appropriate supplier and category for the purchase that they need. So they don't need to know that a screwdriver, for instance, is properly categorized as a power tool or a hand tool. They just enter a search in their natural language search term, and AI, the artificial intelligence component, can parse the cues in that natural language search term and present the user with the appropriate category. And what that does to really reinforce and establish compliance is then once the appropriate category is established, the system can prompt the user only with relevant search results and only with the approved contracted vendors for that particular category. So you're removing opportunities for non-compliant behavior or purchases. And moreover, the AI then makes the entire shopping and checkout process easier for the end user, because once they find the product or service that they need, the artificial intelligence also then defaults the appropriate category code, maps it to the right general ledger code, invokes the appropriate category-specific approval workflow. So as an end user, I don't need to think about entering some 15-digit GL account string or commodity code, or figuring out who needs to approve it, or even to type in my ship to or bill to information. All of that's defaulted based on the ability for artificial intelligence to guide the buying process. So just an example from the Forrester Wave report of some of the latest innovations, and specifically how Zycus addresses those requirements. So let's talk about P2P automation and why it's so critical. You know, most organizations actually today have an imbalance in the way they're able to allocate their procurement and AP resources between strategic and tactical activities. So here's some data from CAPS Research, some benchmarking data that looks at different industries, and certainly there's some variability from industry to industry, but overall across industries, the average is 62% of resources allocated to tactical transactional activities, the ones we're talking about today in Procure-to-Pay, whether that's processing a requisition, generating a PO, matching the POs to the invoices, preparing payments. The imbalance that exists is on average, most organizations are allocating a disproportionately higher percentage to tactical versus more strategic activities like working capital management or supplier management or strategic sourcing. And simply put, the objective with P2P automation is how do we flip the script such that, you know, 2/3 of our resources are on strategic and a third are on tactical instead of the other way around. So really that's what we want to accomplish by automating more of these core transactional and often tactical processes. So let's take a look at how are organizations accomplishing that today in terms of some of the benchmarks for P2P automation. So this data comes from the Hackett Group, their P2P performance study from 2017, and across the bottom you can kind of see the process flow for purchase to pay that starts with a requisition. The requisition gets approved, hopefully through an automated approval workflow, a PO generated. Hopefully that PO gets disseminated electronically, and there may be a change order, releases to blanket orders, but then once the PO is delivered to the supplier, getting the invoice back, going through the invoice matching and approval, and ultimately the payment process. So as we look across this, certainly on the top line, the goal, a digital transformation target, is how do we get to ideally 100% automation. No one's really there yet, but top performers certainly have the vast majority of these transactions fully electronic and automated. And there's, in some cases, a pretty wide discrepancy between what those top performers have achieved and the peer group, which is the average overall. So just to highlight a few of these key transactional processes, certainly the PO is a key process. So top performing organizations have 85% of POs generated and disseminated electronically. So they're sending those out through a protocol like CXML or EDI or through a portal technology. And, you know, now unfortunately anybody who says, yeah, I'm doing it electronically because I'm sending it via email, that doesn't qualify, doesn't meet the test here, because the email is simply a transport mechanism. The automation component is in sending, you know, an electronically formatted document that then can be directly integrated into the supplier's order entry system, for example, without having to be rekeyed. So we're not talking about just sending email attachments. It's truly an electronic document, and here you can see that the average performance is significantly below. Just 1/3 of POs are electronic for the average performer overall. 85% of POs for the top performing organization. Then let's look at invoices. So being able to generate an electronic PO in the first place is sort of the prerequisite to getting electronic invoices back, because then the supplier can flip that PO into an electronic invoice automatically, removing the potential for data entry errors by simply transferring the line item information directly from the PO into an electronically formatted invoice. So not surprising that the top performers have almost the same amount, 79% of invoices coming back electronically, and the peer group continues to struggle in that regard. Then let's get to payments. So 81% of payments electronically for top performing organizations. So that means electronic funds transfer, ACH, wire transfers, card payments, those kinds of things. So a significant advantage there once again over the peer group overall at just 63%. So while we're on the topic of payments, we kind of say this is the final frontier of both AP and P2P automation. So some additional data points for you in Ardent Partners' most recent State of ePayables 2018 report. They came up with a similar benchmark number to the Hackett. About 59% in their benchmark report of B2B payments are electronic. Now, 40% of suppliers today accept e-payments. And I think as Byron takes us through what's possible with the payment automation solutions, you can see doing more outreach to suppliers can push that acceptance rate much higher and certainly help assuage any of the concerns that the 34% say suppliers lack the technology or resources to adopt e-payments. This is all about a solution to help push those adoption rates higher and increase the percentage of early payment discounts, reduce the percentage of payments contested by suppliers. So the quotes here point to the fact that whereas many organizations have traditionally focused on the first P, more and more are coming to the realization that the second P is the key to unlocking the full value in this process, and that sooner or later paper checks are going to go the way of the Rolodex and travel agencies and a lot of other things that have been where the industry has fundamentally been reshaped by disruptive technology innovation, and certainly payments is one of those areas. So that's why we're so excited to announce Zycus Pay. This is the coming together of Zycus and InvoicePay. So Zycus Pay, powered by InvoicePay, is a way to really complete this entire end-to-end process and close that purchase through payment loop. And Byron's going to tell you all about how the InvoicePay and the Zycus Pay solution can drive value for your organization as well, and just sort of how it works together is the Zycus solution manages this entire workflow of requisition through approval and PO up to and including the receipt and matching of the invoice to the point where it's ready for payment or okay to pay. And then the interface to InvoicePay takes that payment-ready list and can combine it with any other payments in the ERP system to really convert the vast majority of payments to electronic and get all the benefits that accrue therefrom. So without further ado then, Byron, let me turn it over to you to talk about the payment automation journey.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Appreciate that. So just to add some context, for a long time, AP payments have been very manual and inefficient. So as Richard talked about, primarily relying on paper checks. And just like in our personal lives, checks are the worst way to make payments because they're time-consuming, expensive, and inefficient. So InvoicePay has created a better way to make AP payments, and that's what we want to spend some time walking through today. So there's often a path that a company takes over time with respect to how they handle AP payments. So they usually will start with a very manual check-driven process, and I'm assuming some folks on the webinar here are in this phase, probably part of the reason that you wanted to join today. And then usually the companies will start doing a few electronic payments based on requests from their suppliers. So suppliers don't really like receiving checks. You know, AR departments don't like checks any more than AP departments do. It's kind of a pain on both sides. So usually the suppliers will ask, like, hey, we'd rather get some electronic payments from you and stop sending us checks. So that'll be kind of the initial phase of moving away from a manual-based process. And then at some point, they'll start to get more serious about electronic payments. And usually companies will work with their bank to start paying a greater percentage of their suppliers by ACH or virtual credit card. And that's really what we mean when we say electronic payments is virtual credit card or ACH payments, and I can dive into each of those as we go along. But this will often create more work for an AP department in that now they'll have multiple workflows. So they'll end up having one process for paying suppliers by check because they're still going to have suppliers that want check. They'll have another process for paying suppliers by ACH, and then they'll have another process for paying suppliers with a virtual credit card. And then if they have international suppliers, they'll have yet another process for that as well. So what InvoicePay does is we are helping companies get to where they would really like to be, where they have a single workflow for all of their payments and use the optimal payment type for each supplier without having to collect and update the supplier's payment information themselves. So imagine if you had complete visibility and control over your AP payments. You never had to think about what type of payment your supplier will accept. You could pay every supplier with just a couple of clicks. You could leverage technology to automate payments without an IT project. And your payment solution would pay for itself and then some. So unfortunately, the reality is that AP teams are still bogged down by an avalanche of activities. And you can see some examples here. So I'm assuming that some of these things resonate with you guys if you're making payments today, if you're part of an AP team. So many forward-thinking organizations have now moved away from the old way of making AP payments, which you can see here. And they've adopted something better that we call intelligent payment automation, which you can see here on the right side. So what is intelligent payment automation? So we refer to what we do as being high-tech, high-touch. So the high-tech is the software and the high-touch is the services. And we're really combining both to make our customers successful. So it means you have a single workflow for all of your payments, regardless of payment type. It means you can give all of your suppliers a range of payment options without needing to coordinate with the supplier yourself. It means you no longer have to follow up on any uncleared payments. It means you no longer have to worry about payment fraud. And it doesn't require you to spend IT resources to shift to electronic payments. So let me dive into a few of the reasons why Zycus Pay is so attractive for customers. So our typical customer is a large enterprise or upper mid-market company, and we don't ask these customers to adapt the way they work. Instead, we provide a very flexible and customizable solution that meets our customers' needs. So you can see some of the features here. And one of the biggest barriers for AP departments to transition from paper checks to electronic payments is that electronic payments require coordination between the payer and the recipient of the payment. So they need to know what payment type is being used, where to send the funds, and where to deliver the remittance. And most AP departments just don't have the time and resources to collect all this information or keep it updated. it changes all the time as new suppliers are added or existing suppliers change their information, like the payment type they accept or their banking information or their contact information. So InvoicePay already has a large network of existing suppliers, which means that we can already pay many of your suppliers electronically. And for any suppliers that are not in our network, we will reach out to find out what payment types they will accept and then use the payment type that's best for you, best for our customer. And we do this both up front when we start working with a new customer and over time each time they add a new supplier. And we maintain and update this data for our customers dynamically. So one of the reasons that many companies decide to use electronic payments is that their suppliers are asking them to. So as I mentioned before, AR departments don't like checks any more than AP departments do. So suppliers like getting paid through InvoicePay, or in this case Zycus Pay, because we provide payment options for them, we provide detailed remittances, we provide visibility on payments through our supplier portal, and we have a supplier-facing support team. So we have both a customer-facing support team and a supplier-facing support team. And lastly, as I mentioned before, check payments are expensive. So when you take into account check stock, envelopes, stamps, toner, and labor, the cost of sending a check is often $5 or more. In contrast, we charge 90 cents plus postage for each check we send for you, but more importantly, we will move most of your payments to electronic payments, and we only charge 43 cents for an ACH and 0 for a virtual credit card payment. In fact, we pay all of our customers a rebate for each card transaction, and those rebates more than pay for our solution for every single one of our customers. So the end result is that our customers are not paying us each month. We're actually paying them a rebate on all their credit card transactions, and so they're receiving money back from the solution. So in addition to all the time efficiencies and cost efficiencies and cost savings, they actually generate a new revenue stream on this. So let me walk you through how our solution works. So the customer sends us a payment file in their preferred format. Now this can come straight from Zycus, or this could come from the ERP. It doesn't matter, we can accept files in any format from any source that you want to send it to us. And this could come via API, it could come via a secure FTP site, or you could just save the file to a desktop and upload it in our interface. But in one way or another, we'll receive a file of all the invoices that are ready to pay. And then we optimize in real time. So basically what that means is we've already enabled all your suppliers for electronic payments. So at the time that we get the payment file, we'll check the file to see which suppliers are being paid and identify the payment type that's best for that payment. And then once that's done, then our customers will have the ability to approve payments. So the invoice approval was already done in Zycus, but you have this additional control of a payment approval. And in most of our, this is an optional feature, but over 90% of our customers, I'd say probably 95% of our customers use the payment approvals. So it's an additional control for the finance team. And basically you can set thresholds around this, but you have the ability to stop, hold, or approve an individual payment or an entire batch of payments. And the thresholds I mentioned, for example, you could say any payment under $5,000 doesn't need approval, but payment over $5,000 needs 1 approver. A payment over $100,000 needs 2 approvers, and so on. Or you could say payments to specific vendors never need approval or always need approval. So all of that's configurable in our system. And once you go ahead and approve the payment, then we go ahead and send that payment out to your supplier. And then we follow up on any type of payment issues or questions. So if there's a card that hasn't been processed, we call the supplier and find out why. If there's a check that hasn't cleared, we follow up with the supplier. If an ACH has a payment error, we get that resolved. If there's any type of fraud, it's on us to get it taken care of. Our customers are completely indemnified. We assume full liability for the payment. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that that payment goes through smoothly. And then we handle incoming calls from the suppliers as well that are about questions. So it's our email and phone number on the remittance. And so we handle thousands of calls per week for our customers to make sure that the payments go through smoothly without the customer having to get involved. And then lastly, we can push the data. Once the transaction is complete, we can push that data back to your accounting system or back into Zycus so that you have full visibility into how that payment was made and when it cleared and confirmation numbers and so on. So there are several people within an organization that benefit from a better AP payment solution. So here are some examples. And then the last thing I'll talk about is that most companies want to transition from paper checks to electronic payment, but there are barriers that prevent them from doing so. And we realize it needs to be really easy to make this transition. So we make it quick and simple for our customers to get started. We do the heavy lifting and allow them to get up and running without doing an IT project. One other thing I'll add is we don't do long-term contracts. It's an at-will contract. So our customers, if they're not happy, they can leave. As I mentioned early in the presentation, we have over 99% retention rate. I think we've lost less than 5 customers in the entire history of our business. So even though we make it easy to leave, customers don't. Once they start using the solution, they're really happy with it. So our goal is to make it easy for you to get started and make it risk-free so that if there's ever any reason that you're not happy with it, you can just go back to the way you're doing things today. So let me turn it back over to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Byron. You know, we said our topic, our theme for today was paying off P2P. So a great example here of, fulfilling on that promise. You've got a solution here that pays for itself, more than pays for itself. When you talk about the typical rebates that are captured through converting to a virtual card payment, for example, on top of all the efficiency gains that are captured along the way. So, in the spirit of that paying off P2P, I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit more on the business case. And the best place to start is with some benchmarks. So when you look at your current P2P process, really be realistic about evaluating how is your current baseline performance stacking up against the industry overall, which is the peer group represented here. And just as importantly, or maybe even more importantly, how close or how far are you from achieving world-class levels of performance? Because certainly with full automation and best-of-breed solutions, such as the combined solution from Zycus and InvoicePay that we're talking about, achieving that world-class status is certainly something that's realistic, that's attainable, and the delta between that baseline performance where you are today and the to-be process in all likelihood represents a very significant and compelling ROI opportunity that you have to pay off P2P. And this is just a sampling of some of the key metrics as we look across Procure-to-Pay. There are a number of efficiency metrics. How long does it take you to complete the requisition to order or invoice approval cycles or the payment cycles? How effective are you at capturing early pay discounts or card rebates, as we talked about? How efficient or frictionless is your process as measured in cost per transaction? What does it cost you to complete a purchase order or an invoice approval process, or the cost to actually pay your suppliers? So, a lot of different data points here, but certainly the starting point is to be able to baseline your performance in a realistic way where you are today, the current state, and then take a look at the to-be potential. And just to kind of bring that together for you here and give you an example, for instance, of how Zycus and InvoicePay would collaborate to build a comprehensive business case for the combined solution. And it's going to be very compelling for almost all organizations. So let's start with a series of assumptions here. Let's say an organization that has about $100 million in addressable spend, and across most of these metrics is probably okay, so at or near the average benchmark performance. Certainly the opportunity may be greater in some cases where there really is zero automation in place, so maybe the actual baseline performance is somewhat below average, but let's provide, give it the benefit of the doubt in this case, $100 million in spend, sort of average performance levels in terms of the transaction process costs and those kinds of things. And commensurate with that level of spending, $100 million, about 10,000 of that goes through POs, 50,000 invoices processed on an annual basis. Some of those invoices then get combined when the payments are issued. So let's say it's 42,000 checks issued annually. And some of those are already electronic payments, but at or near the average. So here we're looking at just the incremental gain to get from a current state, which is okay, which is average, to really best in class with full automation. So when we add it all up, in this case it's nearly $3 million of savings against that $100 million in spending. So about a 3% savings. So clearly very significant in terms of the potential return on investment, just measured in absolute dollars. And you can see the efficiency gains that are possible. Typically, they're going to range between 50 to 70% reduction in the transaction cost. So, a PO going from $17 on average to below $5, or essentially cutting the cost of an invoice, the cost to process an invoice in half, going from just below $5 to about $2.25. And in this case, the cost to process payments on average from above $2 to closer to 50 cents overall. So your results may vary. Every one of these is unique, but a fairly typical scenario in this regard to look at, in a holistic way, what are all the different opportunities, and putting it all together and presenting a case like this to your CFO, for example, is going to be very compelling. It's going to be something that can generate a lot of excitement and impetus for making the change. So it's one of the reasons we're so excited about the combination, the Zycus Pay powered by InvoicePay, is a way to make sure that you're not leaving money on the table. Together this kind of a business case that you're extracting all of the value out of P2P, not just from the front end, but all the way through to completing the cycle with the actual payment. So wanted to then share a couple of case studies to kind of bring it home and illustrate the points of what's being accomplished by some customers in the space. And I think, when you look at these representative case studies, the first one from an insurance company, many of the challenges that they face, I'm sure resonate with a number of companies out there when they look at their purchase-to-pay process primarily being paper-based, so inefficient, and creating lots of opportunities for non-compliant purchases. So a no PO invoice, for example, being a great indicator that effective purchase-to-pay controls were not in place on the front end because there was a commitment, a purchase transaction made without a purchase order in place on the front end. So that means it wasn't properly approved, may not have even been on budget, and in all likelihood was made with a non-approved, non-contracted supplier. So that's a common problem, and certainly was the case here. So lack of controls, an inefficient process, no single source of truth, so no one place to go to see what's going on with the supplier. And of course, one of the benefits from this kind of system is having that kind of visibility, so you can go back and see who approved the requisition, was it on budget, did the invoice match to the PO? Did we pay using the proper payment channel in the most efficient way? Having that kind of visibility throughout the process was really what was lacking in this case, especially since they were really trying to make do with what the incumbent ERP could provide, which was really limited in terms of these kinds of capabilities. So in this case, this insurance company deployed the Zycus solution for an integrated procure-to-pay and supplier management portal, and enabling suppliers is key throughout this whole process. And I think one of the best practices enacted here was not to necessarily try to enable 100% of all suppliers, but certainly to prioritize those suppliers that constitute the greatest percentage of spend and are therefore generating the highest volume of transactions. Each of those key transaction types, POs, invoices, and payments. So by prioritizing those suppliers, and typically the Pareto principle does apply, oftentimes it's the 20% of suppliers that may generate 80% of those transaction volumes. Really focusing on them drives speed to benefit in this case, and enabling them through various electronic means, through portal interface, through CXML processes to enable them for virtual card payments and ACH payments. All of it key to driving a rapid return on investment and benefit scenario. And certainly in their case, they achieved all this with a go-live well ahead of schedule and a critical mass of content available to end users. So that's catalogs and forms for non-catalog purchases and connectivity to the suppliers to deliver the POs, to deliver payments, to receive electronic invoices, etc. So some of the results, just to net it out for you, certainly compliance was achieved. They were able to implement, in fact, a no PO, no pay policy that makes it clear to end users as well as suppliers that you're going to follow the compliant process, that it's going to be digital, and no exceptions will be permitted. Some of the productivity gains that they experienced, they were able to effectively reduce their vendor management FTE support by 87%. So part of supplier enablement is to make suppliers more self-sufficient. They can onboard themselves through your portal. They can provide their credentials to connect to their punch-out catalogs, for example, like a CXML credential, or to receive a PO, or provide you their banking and payment information, so that you're taking all of that friction out of the process by making the suppliers more self-sufficient to give you the data that you need to implement that type of collaboration to make the process truly digital. So that clearly has an impact in reducing the level of effort required in those areas. So freeing up that headcount to be more strategic and more productive instead of being focused on the more tactical activities. And on the back end then, when it comes time to then match that invoice against the PO and goods receipt, that process really was reduced by about a third of the time and 40% of the effort for AP that they were spending on simply processing invoices and having to deal with exceptions, the invoice mismatches that occurred with a more manual process. So it's really the opportunity to enable a straight-through invoice processing, to speed the process along, and free up those resources to do more important and more strategic things for the business. So, by accelerating the process cycle time overall, this insurance company got 1% savings on the spend from prompt pay discounts. And by having a more compliant and transparent process, realized over $100,000 in savings just by eliminating duplicate payments that occurred in their process. So just give you one more quick case study here. Some similarities, some differences, but in this case, a real estate investment firm that faced a number of the key P2P challenges that I think are typical in the market, certainly for those that either have yet to implement Procure-to-Pay or maybe have a first-generation tool that suffers from low adoption and therefore really isn't achieving the desired result. In either case, you may be looking at still highly manual paper-based processes that lack visibility, that don't provide the appropriate controls in terms of an audit trail and approval workflow, and result in inefficiencies, lost savings, lost time, with little ability to effectively collaborate, not only cross-functionally on an internal basis, but also externally with suppliers. So looking at some of the results here and kind of recognizing that there's a yin and yang between the procurement side and the AP side of P2P, that having effective controls, for instance, on the front end in the procurement process, where in this case, this company actually increased the spend on PO by greater than 2x, meant on the back end of AP that there were far fewer exceptions, because after all, if I have a PO to match the invoice to down to a line item level, I have much higher rate of the first pass match and much fewer exceptions, and therefore I'm able to pay on time. So one aspect of this is paying efficiently, that reduces your cost, your process cost, but also increasing the supplier satisfaction and strengthening that relationship, because you're more likely to be able to pay according to term, the terms in the contract, instead of having late payments. Likewise, on the procurement side, getting better visibility to the supply base allowed them to understand where opportunities existed to consolidate and rationalize the supply base. So they cut it nearly in half as a result, and certainly then the back-end benefits that accrue. Fewer suppliers to manage means less manual data entry activity to maintain that supplier master, simplifies the invoice process on the back end and the payment process if you're dealing with a smaller set of suppliers where you have a much closer and more collaborative relationship. Making these tools available to both employees and suppliers, and at this point in time about 50% of this company's employees and suppliers have self-service system access, certainly driving towards 100% as they go forward. But self-service visibility means not having to field, especially on AP side, inquiry calls from either internal stakeholders or the suppliers themselves wanting to know, did you get my invoice? When am I going to get paid? Here on a self-service basis, they can go and see the exact status of their invoice and payment. Has it been received? Is it in the approval cycle? Has it been scheduled for payment? And actually see the remittance information for the payment through the portal interface on a self-service basis without having to pick up the phone and call someone in AP and really distract them from more critical activities. And overall, the process efficiency gains by wringing out inefficiencies end-to-end throughout this purchase through payment process can often mean, especially in a case like this business, which is a high-growth organization, really being able to realize a cost avoidance. So as the business grows with a more efficient, automated purchase and payment process in place, not having to add additional headcount or resources represents an investment, a cost that can be avoided through deploying this type of solution. So those are just a couple of case examples to kind of reiterate how you can pay off from P2P, from automating this process. And I think, Byron, we've covered a lot of ground. May have time for just one or two quick questions here, and one of them for you, Byron, that kind of came up here is, I know I'd presented earlier some benchmark data, in this case from Ardent Partners State of ePayables, that said 40% of suppliers accept electronic payments. And I'd be interested in your perspective how this sort of jives with your experience overall, and certainly I would assume that when those that currently do not accept them, when they can have someone to walk them through the process, that acceptance rate can likely go up significantly.
Yeah, we see in our network across all of our customers, the average is 82% of the payments we make are done electronically. Now, keep in mind, we have a team that's out there working with the suppliers to get them set up for electronic payments, and that's why we're able to drive those numbers. And the reason that those numbers are so important, and I kind of touched on this briefly before, is that electronic payments are so much less expensive than checks. So it's a way to drive down your costs significantly by switching over from check to electronic payments. And so, yeah, that's what we see across our network is it's about 82% are done electronically and 18% done by check. And, of course, even those check payments with our solution, it's an electronic experience for the customer because they're still making all their payments by just clicking a couple buttons, but we send the check on behalf of the customer using the customer's name and logo.
Excellent. And, another question that came in, I think we got folks excited when we talk about the potential benefits and the business case and the ROI. And then the question becomes, okay, how long does this take? And, naturally the tendency from my side to answer that question is it depends, and it really does because, it depends on the scope. Is it global? Is it domestic? Are you looking across multiple business units? All those kinds of things. But the reality here, and many of the components of the solution that we're talking about, automating the requisition process, the invoice process, the payment process can be done in parallel. But I think, with the fact that there is some variability, we're really talking about a period of weeks here.
Yeah, Richard, I'll talk about from our side, setting up the suppliers is typically what takes the longest as far as onboarding a customer. We will be reaching out to all your suppliers and setting them up. There will be a good portion of your suppliers already in our network where we don't have to, but then there'll be another set that we do. So the work by the customer is really minimal. It's mostly on us to do all that heavy lifting, and it really depends on how many suppliers you have. So if you have hundreds or low thousands, it's not that big a deal, but when you have tens of thousands of suppliers, it could take us a while to reach out to all of them. So typically it ranges from 30 days to maybe 90 days if you've got a really big supplier base for us to get them all set up. But most of our clients can go live in 30 to 60 days typically. Even we had MGM, who's a very large customer, went live in 8 weeks from the time they signed the contract to the time they were making payments, and they had quite a few suppliers that we set up in that time period.
Right, so a very accelerated implementation cycle for the payments. Certainly when we talk about the entire P2P cycle, that's where you're going to experience some variability depending on the scope and the complexity, but 6 months or less, certainly for an entire P2P automation and transformation is a reasonable expectation. In some cases, it may be 90 days. So in any case, it's going to be very rapid. So when we talk about those benefits and return on investment, you're talking about getting those benefits, that payback and positive ROI right away, in year one, certainly, and not having to wait for deferred kind of benefits. And I realize we're up against the hour. I did have one other question come in asking actually about the availability of the slides. So thanks to everyone for attending today. You will be getting a thank you email within 48 hours after today's session that will include the slide deck for your perusal. And both Byron and I invite you to reach out to us individually or collectively if you want further information about any of the content or solutions that we presented today. And thanks to you, Byron, for joining, and thanks everyone for logging in.
Thanks, Richard.